Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. The Great Northern War continues. This is part 3. We're just going to jump right into it. Make sure you go see the other two parts if you haven't already. The Great Northern War, of course, Sweden, and the Coalition. Let's see what happens now.
Fair two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair northern Europe. Wait a minute. With Poland-Lithuania out of the fight, Charles XII sets his eyes on another foe, the Russian giant,
Okay, yeah, so Russia's not out of the fight yet.
Peter the Great. While Charles had run roughshod over Poland, Peter had taken advantage of the moment to once again assail the Baltic provinces. He was stopped short of his ultimate goal, but Peter's efforts there were not without gain.
Of course, remember Peter's idea, he wants to get a warm water port to be more western.
His armies carved a path all the way to the Swedish fortress of Nyenskans, which he tore down to build an even greater fortress, the Peter and Paul Fortress, which would serve as the cornerstone for his most ambitious project of all.
St. Petersburg, yeah, I was about to say it. Those things stood for 200 years. I think you have the Decembrist revolts. Was it? Decembrist revolts might happen. I can't remember when they actually happened. I think early 19th century. But I was questioning that then when we did those. Anyway, let's jump back in.
St. Petersburg. He would erect a new city here, one grander and more modern than anything Russia had ever seen. This would be his gateway to the West, his port that tied Russia into the economic life of Europe. It would be his new capital, on which he would spare no expense, in treasure or lives. This was to be the culmination of his legacy, the embodiment of all his ideas on westernizing Russia, on becoming a naval power, on embracing European art and science and culture. But for that to be the case, Russia would have to succeed in holding on to these gains, something that Charles XII could not abide. Throughout 1704 and 1705, Swedish forces tried to take Peter's great fortress, but time and again they were repelled. Soon costs
Is it like a big citadel?
Started to mount, and men that could ill afford to be lost died for little gain. So Charles revamped his strategy and blockaded St. Petersburg. While the blockade dragged on, he began marshalling his main force for a march to the east. It was at this point that Russia sent him a peace offer. In return for an armistice, Russia would give up all of their gains, except for St. Petersburg and the forts connecting it to Russian territory. But Charles was having none of it. He knew how important St. Petersburg was. Why, with his invincible army, should he give it up? So Charles marched east, braving horrible weather and dangerous crossings to move with his traditional lightning speed. As he pressed forward, Peter fell back and back. Each defensive line Peter's commanders had planned to entrench was taken before their men could even unpack their spades. But even this march could not make up for the time Charles had lost trying to make Poland support his puppet king. In the years that had followed his initial victories over the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian forces, Russia had not only seized and fortified what would become St. Petersburg, but reinforced it, and kept reinforcing it. Yet the Swedish army was strong, their king was able, their officers daring and intelligent. Top members of the military thought that it would be a tough fight, but that they could take St. Petersburg. They drew up plans and submitted them to the king, who swore them to utmost secrecy about the plans they had concocted. And so the officers marched, thinking their objective to be St. Petersburg. But soon they found themselves near
Minsk? In Belarus?
Minsk. Wait a minute, that wasn't on the way to St. Petersburg. Charles had marched them in a different direction, and there was only one place they could be going from there. He was marching them to Moscow. Charles's officers had told him that they were not ready, that striking so deep into Russia was simply too great of a gamble.
Didn't we learn? Did we learn yet? No, we haven't. This is just another example of scorched earth, probably. And I'm just so guesstimating this.
It was something the army simply wasn't prepared for. But how many times before had Charles been told that something was too great a gamble? How often had he heard that something was impossible?
Is he gonna pull a Napoleon and be great up until invading Russia?
Only to then achieve it himself. He had made up his mind. They would not waste their time retaking lost territories. He would unseat Peter himself. The first two rivers they crossed with little opposition, being slowed only by the fact that the retreating Russian forces burnt every bridge
So scorched earth, basically.
along the way.
Sort of.
Tartar horsemen also harassed them continually, but this seemed
Instead of Cossacks, you have Tartars. Look, the parallels are uncanny.
a minor nuisance. They were making good time through bad country. But then, at the Wabis River, they found a large enemy force barring their passage. The position held by the Russians was daunting. The Swedes would have to traverse marshy ground to get to them, and beyond that was a forest which might hide yet more troops. But Charles saw a way. The enemy line had a gap in it along a swampy area that the Russians clearly thought was impassable. Charles personally led his army across 1,500 yards of killing ground to reach this swampy area. At one point, his men were shoulder deep in water. The enemy line was split.
That's gotta have like disease-ridden like bacteria all in. Maybe not. It's a river. Yeah, maybe not. It's a river.
The Russians tried to use numbers to heal the breach, but heroic actions from the Swedish cavalry prevented any joining of Russian arms. Soon the line began to collapse. The crossing was theirs. Once again, the Swedes had triumphed against impossible odds.
I mean, I'm being very impressed right now with Charles and the Swedes.
But keen observers in the army would have noted that though the Swedes emerged victorious, these Russian troops were made of sterner stuff than they had been 8 years back. Tactics and firm soldiering had been hammered into them since their retreat at Narva. They would not be turning and running like that anymore. This victory left Charles's army exhausted. It would take a month of rest before he could really move them again. And during this month, Peter was not idle. Peter stripped the land bare. He laid waste to any stretch of ground that the Swedes would have to cross.
And is this the precedent for that? Or did they do that before with the Mongols? That when it started.
And even though it was his own country, and the suffering caused to his own people was immense, Peter made no half measure of it. Every grain of wheat was carted off. Every pasture where a horse might graze was turned to ash. There would be nothing but wasteland for the Swedes to traverse.
Gosh.
Thus began a time of suffering for the Swedish forces. When they resumed their march, food was scarce, and with scarce food came disease. This victorious army began to march as defeated men, with hollow eyes and weary steps. Charles continued to rally them, but he had no real answer to this predicament. He had been counting on living off the countryside as they marched. Their supply lines were stretched beyond their limit. Many asked him to turn home, but he believed in Swedish
This seems like uncanny.
arms. He believed that if he could just force Peter into one decisive battle, they might yet win this war. But Peter demurred. He would not give Charles the battle he wanted. And so the Swedes marched across fields of ash, seeing always in the distance villages alight, candles in remembrance to Peter's uncompromising policy of starvation. In frustration, Charles turned to his officers and asked their advice. They recommended that the army fall back to the Dnieper and meet up with a relief force laden with supplies. But this would be tantamount to giving up the campaign, so Charles asked for other options. Reluctantly, it was suggested that the Ukraine had not been as thoroughly plundered. It might be possible to gather supplies there and enlist the aid of friendly Cossacks. But such a move would
Friendly Cossacks? Oh, interesting.
cut the army off from any real ability to communicate with Swedish territory or get resupply from the Empire. Still, Charles saw it as a possible path to victory where retreat offered none. His officers pleaded with him to at least wait for the relief force and their provisions. But Charles, fearing that further delays would only give Peter more time, turned the army toward Ukraine immediately. They would now retrace their steps until they could turn south, walking back across the same blasted waste from which they had just come. But as summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, a chill set in. Then a deep cold. Then a freezing, bone-gnawing frost. And not just any frost. This was what is known today as the Great Frost.
Oh.
The coldest winter Europe has experienced in 500 years.
Oh.
Rivers froze from the Thames all the way down to the lagoons of Venice. And this frost served Peter well. By the time the winter of 1708 and 1709 came to an end, Charles had only 20,000 remaining men able to fight, less than half the number he'd begun this campaign with. Half of his undefeated army lost. But there's still hope yet. Join us next time.
That's insane. Well, I guess the only good thing is that he turned back when he did. But he's brash. What I've been saying, he's bodacious. It's uncanny the parallels between him and Napoleon. And I said that before he even invaded Russia. It just felt that way. He has like the Hannibal tactics, but like a Napoleon demeanor. Can't wait to get to the next parts. This is very interesting. Something I've never heard about was the North. I might have heard of the Northern War, but never like peeled back the cover. You know, so much to talk about in the future. Thank you guys for being here once again. I appreciate every single one of you. I really do. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye bye.